Welcome back, everyone, to Merge Conflict, your weekly developer podcast. All things in the world of development of stuff and apps and .NET and other things, games and
Games?
HoloLens and spatial reality and Star Trek and all the things.
That's spatial reality. That's, yeah. Hi, James. Welcome to Merge Conflict. It's good to see you, buddy. Yes, we do program all the things because that's what we have to do as programmers these days. There's all the things. And what are you going to do? You got to program all the things. So yeah, we program all the things.
All the things, all the languages. I was just literally going through my GitHub and I was looking at all like the issues and stuff. And I was like, oh man, I got some like crazy repos on here. Cause like when I was doing the My Cadence app, like I did it, obviously I built like the actual app, but then I built like the ESP32 little display thing, and that was in C or whatever, and the Arduino stuff. And then like, just like I'm going through, like I have this like this other random library that I did a binding for, and then this thing, and then that thing. I was like, oh man, my GitHub is just all sorts of different programming languages. It's fun to go through the history of the archives, if you will, Frank. And funnily enough, I didn't mean for it to go to this because we actually have a topic, but I do want to take like 2 minutes to talk about VS Code and mobile development and desktop development. Because
are you going to rant like I did?
No, I'm actually this is a cool net positive. Okay, so one, if we just think about like what I just said on my GitHub is like all these different programming languages. Like one, it's kind of cool that like VS Code just kind of handles all that stuff and it's just like out there. The other thing is I found out that in VS Code, and we talked about it, that you can do these profiles. So you could have like a .NET MAUI profile. You could have like your Java one or Kotlin one or just normal .NET one or C++ profile. So you can jump between. So you're not loading all of these extensions, right? And it actually is true. It's a real thing. It's really cool. And what's nice about that is that it even saves if you're on like pre-release or not. So you could have a .NET MAUI stable, .NET MAUI pre-release profile, and you can jump between those two.
Oh, clever. I didn't think of that. Another way to handle the beta summer. Yeah, have beta profiles. Yeah. I dig that. Okay.
That's cool. But Frank, here's what's kind of neat is VS Code it's like a smorgasbord of extensions out in the world. There's a cornucopia of them. They just are flowing and just it's just going, right? There's a plethora of them. And what's neat is that there's been mobile development and different desktop development inside of VS Code for a long time and other programming like React Native, Flutter and things. And the cool part about mobile development and desktop development is that no matter what programming language you're building stuff in, there's a lot of things that are common between the setup, right? So like actually like launching emulators and simulators, like messing around with the Android debug bridge, messing around with different manifest files, like those things are all the same. So like I did a video where I was like, let me like look up a bunch of like, there's a bunch of cool .NET MAUI extensions that people have built, but I was like, let me just look up normal Android-y stuff. And there's literally one called like Android and iOS emulators, and it'll just puts a little device button inside of VS Code, and you click it, and it's like, what emulator do you want to start? What iOS simulator do you want to start? And you're like, oh wow, this is cool. Like, how great is that?
I was wondering if I brought that up when we were talking about the extensions one time, but I call them launchers. There's a lot of launchers in VS Code, honestly, because the launch.json file is really cryptic and really hard to understand and all that stuff. So it's really nice when people build user interfaces that are just like, yo, just point me at the .app, what device you want. I'm just going to make it happen. I'm just going to make it happen. You really have to appreciate those apps. I like automation. I like it when like the mainline tooling works perfectly, but it's great having these little launcher guys to just say, just run this silly app, please.
Yeah. And it's the same. Like there's that. And then I was messing around today with just showing off like, debugging to an Android device and how easy it is to get set up. But there's an extension called I think it's like ADB something. I don't know. You just type in ADB, which is the Android debug bridge. And there's like all of these commands. And yeah, I know that you could go memorize the commands and do all this stuff. But man, there is something really nice to being like restart server, like do this thing. And they even have a command that's like install APK on this device, and it will like have you select the APK and then pick the device, and it'll like call the install command. Oh, that's just pretty nice in general, that it's just there and works everywhere. Oh, and like also they're pretty easy to develop. So I am fascinated to see as time goes on how it evolves. And we see more and more extensions, because like there's nothing stopping anyone from doing like a little previewer, like a little, you put Wii in there, you could do anything. You could drag and drop stuff. You could just build stuff.
Yeah. I wish I did it more.
Yeah.
I've been writing IDE extensions basically my whole career, and I don't think they've ever really been much easier than they are now with like VS Code. Lots of templates out there. The shortest, simplest examples are pretty short and simple.
Yeah.
You have to write them in JavaScript, whatever, deal. There's ways around that, obviously. You can always shout out to different apps. But yeah, I've even read the docs, that's how far I've gotten. I'm like, someday I could write an extension, because I am inspired by everyone's creativity there. You're saying you're wait to see what happens. There's no waiting and seeing, man. We're at the top of the mountain right now. Like, extensions are coming in fast and furious. Like, just
True.
What you need is time to go browse through them all, because you search for something broad like JSON, you're going to get 8,000 extensions. How do you know which one to even try? I mean,
True.
even Python, there's Microsoft themselves have like 3 different Python extensions.
Yeah.
So, it can be a little fun getting through them all. But anyway, I agree with you. It's a fun wild, wild west out there.
Yeah. Good to get it. All right. We had a listener suggestion, Frank. What is it?
Yes, we were asked to take a step back, James. We're always talking about our setups and things, and this came a little bit out of our setting up a Macintosh, your discussion, setting up a new computer. And in that discussion, I had mentioned, well, thank goodness things have changed where I don't actually rely on my dev machine anymore to produce production builds of things. I like to think that you helped mature me a little bit there and force me to embrace the world of CI/CD. And we had mentioned that, and in the beginning, I didn't talk about CI/CD because I didn't use it. And then eventually you taught it to me, and then we talked about it a lot, but it's been a while since we've done a review and kind of the state of the art. So there was a little bit of a request that we just take a little step back and talk about our actual setups. How do we actually build things? And I thought it'd be fun because it's not complicated, but it might be fun to just review how our apps are actually getting built these days in 2024.
True. No, yeah. So when you think about it, there's two different parts of the coin there, which is continuous integration and continuous delivery. Now, each of them provide value in different ways, and to me, I personally end up using continuous integration and builds more often than actually delivery, because I'm building and shipping code often, but not actually shipping my app all that much. But it depends on the app, right? Because some apps I want to like continuously ship into test flight, for example. Like every time I push to main, it's like go, go, go. But sometimes, depending on how I'm developing the application, it's more of a manual process. Or a good example is, hey, for NuGets, it's another good example. Every single time I push something to main, then I just go ahead and do a release of a preview, and then I'll manually say, let's push the public NuGet out there. That's there. But the integration part is nice, because when I think of continuous integration, part of it is just building of the application, but the other part is the integration part, which is into your development lifecycle and what you're doing. So what's neat about that is that a lot of the different software that we use today, like GitHub, for example, but other different integrations, like even Slack, for example, or Teams or emails or whatever it is, enable you to get information and do validation. So, for example, building just pass or fail is great, but what if you had a report? What if you got a notification when a build was completed? What if it ran additional checks on your code? What if it, primed something and dropped a file for you to install, like an Android application, without actually shipping stuff, right? So there's all these different things along the way, but that to me is the two parts of the CI/CD, but also the two parts of CI. I don't know, how do you feel about it? How do you think about it? If we're stepping back, it's a methodology, Frank. It's a whole methodology of continuous integration.
I think you just invented another category. We'll call it CJ, like continuous James. Because a lot of the things you mentioned, I consider kind of the advanced features, generating reports. So like part of continuous integration, I think, are just the very basic steps. Does it build and do the unit tests pass? I'm not a great unit tester. I don't go for 100% unit test coverage, but I make sure everything at least has some unit test, something that can be run quickly at the command line, that kind of thing. So for me, that's the continuous integration. The advanced things like performance reports, comparison to previous. I like to do a lot of tests where you just have results from previous runs and you compare against the previous runs and you just look for a difference. And so like all those kinds of advanced things. But for me, the continuous integration, I want that to be really fast. I want that to run in a minute or two once some code is pushed up. So in my mind, the way I differentiate CI/CD is simply the CI is the fast one. And the CI is the thing that I just want to make super fast pull requests, and everything should be really safe to do a CI. But I totally get it if you want to generate reports, code coverage, all sorts of fun things you can do with automation. So I'll say it's not even a philosophy. It's more of an engineering thing. I just want them to run fast. So that's how that's my CI. And then for CD, where I'm actually trying to create like a production build, that's a different thing we'll get into.
Yeah. I think if we take a step further back, like you were saying, is, hey, I'm a developer. I'm the person that wrote in. Like, give me the basic building blocks here. What are we actually talking about?
Yeah.
And for me, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head, which is there's all sorts of stuff that you can do. But actually, the most important thing is that it just builds in a clean environment at all. Because even though I may hit the build button, there are instances in which maybe I accidentally press additional keystroke, or like I actually write some code and then don't build it for some reason. Like I've done that. We've all done that. We're that code works. So commit that. You know what I mean? And the key here is that everything's done in branches against pull requests, and that's the key of it is, you don't just work off of this magical main line all the time. You are doing pull requests in that are getting a validation run on it. And then you're getting information. So a simple it built or it didn't build is very, very important there too. And that is also a clean environment. So you might have your machine configured in a special way, but with some dependency. Whereas when you're just building it naturally, which means if Frank was to pull down my code, it may not work on his machine because it's not this magical setup. So it provides that clean environment that's there. So if you literally say that's two things, which is, I want to make sure it builds, not even unit tests, just it builds. Button, build and do nothing else. Step one, build. And we're not even saying package it, just like literally build it.
Debug, build, I don't care. Just done. Is anything working?
Is anything working? Done. Good enough, right? And then we leave the deployment stuff for later, because that deployment is very different to a lot of people. But the thing that it's solving is works on my machine, deploys from my machine, and this shifts it to, I can literally go and manually edit a file on GitHub, and I could still be able to build and deploy my application when I am in the middle of, South America, for example. Like I'm on a plane and I have like the worst Wi-Fi. I can't even pull down the artifacts, but I can edit a text file and that's it. That is the, oh wow, this is a cool moment that's happening here.
Right. And we do get wrapped up in the continuous part, I think, a little bit too much, because a lot of the analysis report stuff, a lot of that can just be run manually. But what you want to do is make it easy to run it manually. So I'll still script all that stuff up as a GitHub action, but the only trigger for it will be, I forget what they call it. It's a like workflow dispatcher. There's some terrible thing you say as the trigger, and that just makes a little button in the UI. So now you can just click the little button and then the thing runs. So whenever I want, and I don't have to worry about it running all the time if it's slow and eats up all my dollar bills, because these things do cost money. So, yeah. I do watch for those kinds of things. But yep, you nailed it. That's all I'm looking for in my first CI pass. So literally my like GitHub action steps are the absolute minimum to achieve that. Install .NET, download my own code, run .NET build.
Yeah.
I try to keep that basic too. I have a philosophy of I don't like advanced build steps. They should all be roughly things I would run at the command line myself. So that's it. That's my CI, honestly. Oh, and .NET test. And I do combine the test with the build, mostly for performance, because it does take like a good minute and a half, I think, to set up .NET and get the environment all happy. Add a little bit more if you actually need to download the workloads to run your tests. But I actually try to write my tests so I don't need the workloads, just straight .NET stuff. So do the build, run the tests, because the tests are usually really fast compared to the build. So bing bang, that's the CI part.
Yeah. And I think that the other nice part is that you have a lot more control over this clean machine. So you get to decide, is it .NET 8? Is it .NET 8 dot whatever? Yeah. Like you can decide the point release of what you want to build and what you want to ship on compared to might be on your machine. And that also is helpful because if a lot of people are working on a project, they might have different versions of .NET and different functionality and things like that they're expecting. And we all know that not everyone's running their tests every single time, and that's the nifty thing. So while I do think that building is the bare minimum, build, and if you have tests, it's just another thing. And I think you made a point earlier is you're just doing what you would do at the command line or even in the IDE. You're either doing run or test. And inside of your YAML breakdown for GitHub Actions, they could be GitHub Actions, they could be Azure DevOps, they could be other CI/CD. There's the plethora of them out there, right?
All the
At the end of the day,
insert your favorite.
Insert your favorite. Yes, they are literally just calling commands to build and execute. So you're just running a script for all intents and purposes, and that script has steps, and each of those steps need to pass. So, for example, if for some reason you have something, I don't know, that you're looking to run, like, hey, I want to build and restore some NuGets, and someone messed up the NuGets, and that step would fail, right? Or you want to install .NET, but something like it's either going to succeed or fail, right? And it's either going to build or not build. And the cool part too is you can have it build your entire solution, a single project. You can do all sorts of things, and you can run them in parallel, right? That's another thing too, is even a great example of just continuous integration where you don't do anything else, like no testing, no building, anything like that, is we have a bunch of GitHub Actions set up on our workshops. And inside of like the .NET MAUI workshop, for example, there are 6 different stages, and each stage has a copy of the source code and a finish. Well, anyone could change code in any of those. So what we do is we set up .NET, and then we say, hey, build these 6 projects all at the same time, parallelize them, and it does a matrix and builds all of them. So that's great, because not only is that helpful when I'm pushing code and doing things, but that means other people can contribute, and we can make sure and we can guarantee that, hey, this thing builds and it's good to go with any little code change that maybe checked in accidentally. Because, as code reviewers, it's really easy to miss a semicolon, for example, or it's easy to miss some typo, right, in there. So that's a nice part too.
I do want to give a quick pro tip. If you're like me and in setting up .NET every single time you run these puppies, you should have a global.json file, because we're all on the global.json bandwagon, right? It's the only way to keep your sanity in this fast-changing world of .NET versions. So in your global JSON file, you declare which version of the SDK you want, or a minimum. You can, fancy flags and all that fun stuff. And then in your action, however, speaking in GitHub Actions world, there's setup.net, and you can just point it at your global JSON file. So that way, you really don't want to be in that world where your build system and your source code are getting out of sync. So this is just a nice way to keep the build system and the source code perfectly in sync.
Yeah, back in the day, I'm a very visual person. So my preferred way of doing continuous integration is to have a service kind of outline what it's doing. But the world has moved towards build infrastructure that's checked in. Now, there is an advantage to this, which is, let's say that .NET 9 comes out in November, and Frank and I are working on a project and we want to upgrade to .NET 9. Well, we'd create a branch called .NET 9, but we always want to make sure main is still building, right? So we wouldn't change the main infrastructure, but we could change the stuff in the branch. And what's cool is that the build that happens will look at whatever is in the branch, right? For the build definition. So we could say, hey, I'm upgrading this to .NET 9 in this branch right here. You see the file and it says to install .NET 9, right? But if Frank then is like, oh, I got to really get this bug fix out, but we don't want to mess up things. He just does a new pull request against the normal mainline build, and it's just will continue to work and ship and do all these other things. So what's really cool is that, and then you can sort of branch and fork and do a bunch of things, snapshot it basically for all intents and purposes, and that build definition is there. Comparatively, while I do love a good visual system, in my personal opinion, it's the best. When you're doing a visual system, it means that it's sort of global, right? You could create a bunch of different definitions. I understand that, but it's hard to keep those in check, right? You're not going to create a bunch of these visual things and copy them. So what ends up happening, even for me today, for example, is I have a update for the in-app billing library, and it's in Azure DevOps, and I just have it there because I'm just been there forever. It's just like been there for 10 years at this point. And it's a visual setup. So there's nothing checked into source code to do it. And this is completely okay, by the way. If you're just getting started, you're like, I want something visual, please help me. Because it'll also export the YAML for you if you really just wanted to. But what's interesting about what I'm doing, which I shouldn't do because it's like bad practice, is like whenever I'm like, oh, I need to cut a new build of this new thing for .NET 8, I literally go into the build script. I'm like, change it to install .NET 8. And then I'm like, okay, now like actually build this specific branch and go. It's just me being lazy. But again, it's still better than nothing because everything else continues to work at the end of the day. But that's not the goal, right? The goal hopefully is to smooth and streamline the process of all of it happening. So that's one thing that's kind of nice. Yeah.
Well, I think we are lucky. I think it is good that our build definitions are checked in with the source code. I think that was a good revolution that happened some years ago. I think it just, I don't know. How can you, it's hard to keep a web UI straight with like your own source code. It's hard enough to keep track of everything. And then the idea of not repeating yourself, that's just good programming practice. We don't want to put what version everything is everywhere, make sure you use, what's the new thing, directory.packages.moon.summertimehappiness.json.yaml. Use that file and put all your NuGet versions in there too, so that you're not repeating yourself all over the place. And now let's blur the world CI/CD. I blur this world because my apps have UIs, which means I need to do platform builds. So if I want to build an iOS or Mac app, I need to use a Mac build server. Oh, the other nice thing I should have said about CI in the .NET world is like you can just use a Linux machine. They're cheap. And do your build and your tests on that. But eventually you got to build like a Windows executable or a Mac executable or something like that. And so that's where the waters muddy a little bit for me with the CI/CD, because although I may not in the end actually deploy it to a server, to people, to anything, in my mind, I still have to go through all the same steps. I have to make sure I have the full SDK installed. I have to get my certificates and my provisioning in order so I can actually create a correctly signed executable and all that stuff. And my specialty, everyone knows, iOS, Mac, but this all applies for Android and Windows. It's computer science is computer science. This is how we do things. So my CD, I often have it off just for cost savings, honestly. Like doing an iOS build for iCircuit takes like 17 minutes. Doing a Mac build takes 8 minutes. Not debug builds, when you're deving, it's all fine, it's all groovy. But we're doing AOT, and I have all the optimization settings turned on high, so it takes a while. So for CD, we can talk through the steps, but it basically I have to repeat the steps for each platform. That's how I roll. Everyone do it the way you like it, but for Android, I'm going to repeat these steps. For Windows, I'm going to repeat these steps. For Mac iOS, I'm going to repeat these steps. And at the end, the difference between the CI/CD is simply whether I have a flag saying upload it to a server or not. But I'm going to go through the same steps.
There's two different philosophies, I think, when it comes to the CI/CD part. Like, there's definitely a philosophy, which is the continuous integration. The thing that it finishes with are deployable assets, artifacts, if you will. Like, here is the thing. That is one way to look at it, but it depends on what you're working on too. So for example, like you were saying, is I don't necessarily want iCircuit to be fully built every single time. I just want to verify that the code builds. I don't want to publish and package and do a bunch of stuff to it. And I do think that that's okay to do. Then the real question ends up becoming, what's the trigger there, right? So for example, some people like to have a multi-tiered system where there's main, dev, and then branches off of dev. So for example, Frank might say, all right, I'm just going to, my CI/CD set up here. And if it's dev, and what the cool part is these definitions in the GitHub Actions, you can say, if the branch is dev and you're merging into it, just build it. Just really quick and dirty go. But if this is a PR into main, right, then actually let's sign and package these things up. That's when it gets serious. So that's one way of looking at it, of just saying, okay, like when this happens, now we're going to do the signing, we're going to do the publishing on it, and we're going to have the artifacts that are deployable. There is some folks that have like this middle tier, which is like, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually say, hey, this CI part is good. Okay, now let's try to do the packaging part of deployment. I think if Donovan Brown was around, he would be like, no, that's a big no. But I always say what works best for you, because it's tricky in the world of mobile development. At least a lot of people come and they say, hey, well, I have a bunch of different internal URLs and this thing and that thing. What do I do? So we're going to like build your app multiple times, right? So in that instance, you might want to make it so, dev creates a build when merged in, makes it, because you can even control, you can say, if it's a pull request, then do these things. If it's actually merged in, then run the build again and then do these other things, right? So you can actually, you can have a trickle in. So you could say, hey, do these things. What I used to do is when I had things with different URLs, is I would, in my continuous integration, say, build the app twice and publish it twice. And one would be with dash dev, and then one would be like dash production, and one would be for me there. Nowadays, there's things that are smarter. You can just re-sign a package. But if your variables are different, then you might need to do that. So I would say this, though, at the end of the day, there are some really seamless ways of deploying things out there, right? App Center was one in the past. There's a lot of other ways of delivering your app, but at least on iOS and Mac, TestFlight is a great way of just saying, just ship it out to TestFlight and go. But there's also this gate. And I think the cool part is the gate part of it, is what we were talking about, is like for my NuGets, for example, I don't actually publish it with everything to main. I build it and they're sitting there. And I'm like, am I ready to publish this version? And if so, I can say approve, because I'm using Azure DevOps. There's an approval process. I can say approve. And when that's in beta and it's good to go, it will retain that build. And then I can go back and say, move to production. And then it ships it to production and changes the versions and does different stuff like that. So there's that aspect of it. But let's say, again, because every thing is different, your deployment can be all sorts of different things, right? I think this is the cool part about it. It's like, what will just save you time? So when I was getting started, I was doing a lot of Android development. I would just be like, just send me a link to the APK because on Android I can just install the link and download it. You know what I mean? Before the services were out, like Hockey App or App Center or App Delivery or things like that. That was super duper nice, right? And that's cool. There's other ones that are like, hey, just deploy this static web app to this test environment, right? And you can literally just drag and drop and do stuff around. So the deployment part's like up to you what level that you want. But I think the most important part is just figuring out what step of the process do you want to actually create those artifacts and have those artifacts around. Because the one nice part about that is that those artifacts will remain around, right? Like when I used way back in the day when I used to not do CI/CD, I had a folder that was called app releases and had all the versions. And it's like, here's just the .ipa file and APK file that's just sitting out here. And I'm like magically doing it. I have no idea what build or whatever it was for, but it was to that point, right? So there's a wide spectrum is what I'm saying available to the CD part. Oof.
GitHub deletes them eventually, thank goodness, because honestly, at first you're like, yay, I'm getting a full binary build out, and then it turns out you don't really need to manually download these things that often. So it's like, thank goodness GitHub deletes them eventually, because otherwise I'd just have gigabytes on gigabytes of things. I want to be clear, in an ideal world, I would love to do a full 100% packaging build of all these apps in CI. Yeah. But I would have to wait an hour for every time I did a code change, and that's not how that should work. You want your CI to be fast. You want results quickly. Yep. So yeah, you are picking that gray area. I don't. The gates are really up to you and your team and everything. I'll mention what I do, but whatever, do whatever you like. I do use main as the source of truth. That's what I consider a production build. Use branches otherwise for all the other things. To again conserve basically money. What I have is all the actions run at midnight or a different time at night. Basically, when I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be uploading any more code. And it just checks, has there been any changes to main in the last 24 hours since I last ran? If there have been, then it does the god-awful hour-long build and builds out all the platforms. Yeah. And that's when I actually do a full CD. I do a deployment. So to TestFlight, to Android, to whoever will accept my builds. I'd rather they host them than I do, so send them out, I say, and delete them from GitHub so you don't have to pay for them. So I take advantage of the continuous deployment, but I do that one little trick of I run it under a cron job and just check to see if it really needs to run or not.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think that's the thing is there are a lot of different actions or jobs that you can run, different triggers basically that are out there. It's kind of like an Azure function, right? There's lots of ways of triggering these things. And I think you make a great point to what works best for you and for your setup. The big thing is like, how do you extract value from it? And I think if it's just the core of this thing builds and I have this reliable build, like that's a perfect first step, right? And start there for all intents and purposes, really get that going. And the reason that they call things nightly builds, right? Like, when you go like, hey, give me the nightly.
I took it seriously.
It's because I think that's where it comes from, right? It's like,
yeah, for sure.
You can only have like a nightly build of Windows because I'm sure that Windows takes a long time to build, right?
It
you know what I mean?
Roughly 20 hours.
There you go. So you get a nightly. And that's the cool part is that you get to decide when and how and where, you decide to do these specific builds because you do want those results fast. There's nothing worse than like, just if I mess up this thing and this thing, I have to wait for it to fail because I'm halfway through installing this other stuff. Like, let me just get my test results back as fast as possible when we're talking about it. And the other part too is if you do things on that night, that means like you can wake up and you have a new build and ready to go. And I'll say this really quick is like, it's up to you, right? I think if you integrate any of these integrations into anything, it's a win. But there's no need to be perfect about anything. We're not here because let me be honest with you.
Better than building on your dev machine. Sorry.
Exactly. If you can get at least that, if you can get the builds off your dev machine, then perfect. Even for me, for example, like I am notorious for downloading an artifact and then uploading it manually myself. Because like, for example, on Android, of course, it's really easy for me to test it like locally, but I'm like, I don't know if I trust the CD system to like get the exact settings I want for this exact build, right? I don't have that in there. Maybe I want this to be a 7-day rollout. Maybe I want it to be specific release notes, right? Like if I actually got it all set up correctly in the system, you could do all of it, right? You could really optimize it so you have a file that has a release notes. It's going to pull them. It's going to put it in the Google Play portal. It's going to do this stuff. You know what? I'm just a solo dev. Maybe I'm a small dev team. It's okay if I'm like, this is the build. I download that Android bundle and I just upload. Like all I'm doing is doing what the automation did, and it took me 5 minutes of my time. But I saved hours upon hours of time with all of the other junk that I didn't have to do on my machine. Like it's okay. Like people are like, it's like we talk about MVVM, like with .NET MAUI or Xamarin before that. People are like, oh, how dare you put any code in your code behind for shame. Like there's no shame. There's no shame. You do what's best for you and it'll evolve over time. The stuff that Frank and I were doing 10 years ago when it came to CI/CD, completely different than what we do now. Different steps. And actually, I do sometimes less things than I used to do because I was like, you know what? It's just faster if I just do it myself. That's okay.
I think we should have a quick lightning round and just say the steps. Say the steps. I want to be very explicit. Like, how does one actually build an app? So, lightning round, James. Okay, let's assume we're in action. Action's already been performed. Git has already checked out your source code. What's usually your first action? What's your first action?
Oh, does it already has .NET on the machine or no?
Nope.
Oh, you mean I just installed
source code.
Install .NET.
Install .NET? Okay, nice. Interesting place to start. I bumped the version first. Who knows? The version might get involved somewhere, or there might be some NuGet things happening. So I bumped my version. Would you bump your version after you?
I'm pretty synonymous for using timestamps for build numbers. So,
oh yeah, I should say by version, I mean somewhere in an action, you got to tag your build, and you want to do that in a source code or a config file or something. You want to get that commit hash in there. You want to get the date in there. You want to get a few things in there just to give you a fighting chance for when that bug report comes in that you can track down the source code.
That's true. That's true.
That originated it. Yeah. So you want to do that. And the iOS platform, you have to install provisioning profiles and certificates. It is that world. So I want to tell everyone the quickest, easiest way to do this, at least in the GitHub Action world. Of course, there's Xcode builds and things are all different and all that kind of stuff. You want to use Apple Actions import code sign certs. It requires that you upload your certificate in a base 64 encoding into the secrets of your GitHub Actions and all that kind of stuff. At the same time, you also want to hash your password and upload that into the GitHub Actions because you're going to need to open that certificate and add that certificate to the key store.
Yeah.
And to do that, it needs a password. So step one in the Apple world is install your certificate. Because the good news is, once you have your certificate installed, you can use Apple Actions, download provisioning profiles, and it will just go get the rest of the stuff that you need. That has been the greatest advancement since the beginning because managing profiles and certificates through CI/CD was always the worst, just the worst. If you thought it was bad on your dev machine, it was worse in CI/CD. This still has the downside. Apple certificates expire once a year. So once a year, you get to go upload a new certificate. But that's just the world. That's the world, James.
I think that's a good point. Actually, if we were thinking about the order of operations is do everything quick first. Because you don't want to wait to build and then install the profiles because what if the build fails 5 minutes in, or if it succeeds, but then your provisioning profiles don't, work, then you've wasted 5 minutes of your build for no reason. So do the things fast. And the same thing's true on Android. You can get the Android signing keys and get all that into your GitHub secrets and things like that. If you're using Azure DevOps or Bitrise or other things, you can just drag and drop files in and it's like good to go too. So there's ways of doing that as well. So yeah, get your signing things on there. And the recommendation here is do these, by the way, in separate actions. Like, don't, like, you can run multiple things all at the same time. So don't be like, build my iOS app and then build my Android app and then build my other thing. Like, you build all of them all at the same time. That's my personal opinion out there.
Yeah, and you're not. I used to wonder, like, am I saving money? I'm sounding very cheap over here. I'm cost effective, everyone. I'm not cheap. But I used to wonder, like, oh, it's more expensive because you upload a build and all of a sudden you see like 6 machines spin up doing your build. You're like, oh my god, how much am I paying? But in the end, like, it is faster because, like, I'll do Android builds on Windows machines because Windows machines are cheaper and the build goes very fast. And so I pick my operating systems based on how fast they can build things.
And there's free tiers too, by the way of things. So you could start for free.
I just build a lot. So when you build a lot, you end up paying in the end. And now, James, the world has gotten so much better. How does one install .NET? You do the thing I said before. You do the global JSON. Now we're just repeating the CI. But now instead of saying .NET build, you just do. I do a .NET build with a million little parameters because I like to tweak a few settings here or there. Put it in release mode. Sometimes specify specific runtimes and that kind of stuff. But the world is pretty great because going back to setup, it's just a .NET workload restore to get, to download basically half of the universe, it seems, in the logs, but eventually you download half the universe, and it's surprisingly fast. Thank goodness for fast internet connections. I don't know how that works, but it downloads half the universe in usually about a minute and a half. For me.
It's pretty quick. One thing that I recommend people do too is, if it's really easy to go into your build, and some people just do .NET workload restore, or you can also do .NET workload install, right? You can specify what workloads you want. It's really easy, by the way, to just be like, .NET workload install Maui, just give me Maui. However, if you're only doing a build for iOS, you only need Maui iOS. Like, you don't need all of the other stuff that comes with it. So you can be more granular in your setup. So most of my builds for .NET, Maui applications, if I'm building an iOS app, like, just give me, give my provisioning profiles, install .NET with that, and then just install just the specific Maui iOS bits, and that will reduce what will need to be installed on the machine. So pro tip.
And this goes hand in hand with what you're saying about being parallel too, because there's no reason to install the iOS SDK if you're doing a Windows build. It's just very wasteful. And you can even throw in a lot more command line arguments to say specific target frameworks and things like that to really speed things up. When I'm really desperate to speed things up, I'll build them single project by single project. But I try not to do that. I'd rather throw a whole solution at it. But sometimes my solutions are too big. That's a me thing. That's my fault.
So then you build it. So you got your stuff, then you build it. Or are you doing stuff before or after the build?
So this is the beauty. The packaging built into .NET's pretty good. You get it builds your .app. It builds your .package. If you're one of those weird Mac people like me, you need one of those puppies. So those just kind of pop out at the end. So the rest is up to you. This is where the deployment part comes in. Like, and a lot of times I just throw them out. Packaging complete. Good job, iCircuit. Going in the garbage. Into the recycle bin you go. Again, might be me being a little bit cheap, but I just don't feel the need to keep a lot of those builds around unless I'm going to deploy it up to test flight or something like that. So that's where in my GitHub Actions, I just have an if, and the if just checks my conditions if I really do want to do a deployment. So like I said, I like to do single button click kind of deployments. So I always have that option. If I click the button, it'll do a proper deployment. If it's one of those nightlies, like I mentioned, then it'll do a proper deployment. And again, these aren't going out to production. These are going to a staging, test flight. It's a beta staging. It's not production. Not production, everyone. Don't auto deploy to production yet. But it's so basic, like life has gotten good. it's really just build the thing and then deploy it.
And we should say that it's not like you're scripting all these things by hand. In whatever CI/CD tool you're using, there's going to be these predefined steps and runners that do things. So when Frank was talking about the provisioning profiles and different things like that, like that's a specific kind of step that you not install, but you're putting as part of your script. And you're saying, hey, there's this step out there, this action out there that knows how to basically pass it some information and it will go do stuff for me. So when I say, .NET, the .NET stuff, it just knows to install .NET and I can run .NET commands. And the same thing when I'm deploying to test flight, like there is a little, an Apple distribution step that can do multiple things that it's able to distribute to test flight, for example, given credentials, given the package that's there, it'll automatically handle it for you there. So it's not like you're writing code to put it into test flight. That doesn't exist. Someone else wrote the code for you.
Absolutely. Like mine is, we'll call it 8 lines of code, but that's all me just saying the name of the app and that kind of stuff for the deployment. It's all good info that you're providing. I've mentioned the names of all the other actions, so I might as well mention this one. It's apple-action/upload test flight build. Doesn't get much simpler than that.
Yeah.
I remember the bad old days when the stuff was much harder, and I'm pretty happy that we're at this state. I'll admit I do have way funkier build scripts than that, but it's usually weird stuff that comes up, like a weird nougat that I'll want to dissect and do something very nasty to for my nefarious reasons, or other things like that. But truth is, I think CI/CD has gotten pretty simple these days, and you can get up and running pretty quickly. I remember the old joke of it would take you like 50 revisions of your actions file before you actually got a good build. I average more around 6, 7. Takes me about 6 or 7 revisions, and I usually get an app build out in the end.
And the cool part is that if you are building similar apps, you have multiple apps, you can just copy that YAML file and then boom, you're good to go, right? So there's kind of like a nice thing that's
beware copy and paste. I've made a couple mistakes, but yes, normal programmer, beware.
Gives you a good setting there. And then the last part of it that we talked about earlier is, you just said like, oh, don't publish to production from it. Like a lot of people want end to end, right? And I think that is a you decision that's out there. I have many of mine. It depends on what I'm building. Like I have some Azure functions at work that get deployed into Azure, and I say, hey, if it's a successful build of main, just deploy that puppy. Like we've verified it, it's good to go, right? just let's do it. I trust the code that much, but I also know that it's already in a very stable place where it's just going to work and deploy. I've done that for many GitHub websites and Azure static web apps. Easy peasy, just like, hey. And that was really cool. And I was doing the coffee business is I just had it as a Blazor app, and it was an Azure static web app. So I said, hey, every time I make a change to main, just like go publish this thing. And I would be changing the coffee stuff and doing stuff like out on my iPad, and I just modify files. It just builds and deploys, and like, boom, there it is. But when it comes to apps, I'd say that I've never once published a production from any CI/CD service. I never have done it ever. My process is to go into the Apple developer portal, create a new release, fill in the release notes, select a build. That build was from test flight.
Yes.
Now that build got to test flight via CI/CD and it was good to go. For Android, I have had it where it uploads into the alpha state automatically for me, which is pretty nice. It's kind of like test flight, you've been alpha. I'll do that normally. And then it's the same thing now inside of Google Play developer portal, where you can just say, create a new release, use this build that's already in alpha, for example. So it's a lot less that I'm uploading builds manually because they're already there, but I'm not necessarily saying, hey, CI/CD service, go take this thing and go do I just go do it manually. I don't know. That's just me.
Yep. No merge conflict here. You and I operate on the same. manual actual production releases, I don't know, maybe it's old fashioned, it's ceremony, but it makes you take a step back and think, okay, I'm doing a production, am I really that confident, versus the machine just being like, yeah man, let's do it, let's go man. I'm automated. You only live once. So yeah, I do the same thing. All the deployments go up to a staging, and then I pick and choose. I think I even do NuGet packages the same as you. I manually download the artifacts and manually upload them like a barbarian. But I do like that moment of pause it gives you, like, are we sure? Are we sure we want to publish this thing? So I think it's worth having that little pause there.
Yeah.
But if you like to roll the dice, or it's just a website, just your blog, of course, my blog just publishes, typos be damned.
Yeah. There you go. All right. Well, there's our basic introduction to CI/CD. Let us know what you think. How are you completely different? Are there different services that you're using? Let us know. Go to mergeconflict.fm and go ahead and leave a contact over there. You can send us an email. Best way to get a hold of us is go over to YouTube, and you might already be there. You can leave a comment below on any of the YouTube videos. We check those every single week. So youtube.com/@mergeconflictfm, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. But that's going to do it for this week's Merge Conflict, Frank. We did it.
A CI/CD show. Continuously done.
Shipped it. Now I'm actually going to have to do a bunch of hard work and actually edit this podcast and upload it. I got a CI/CD this podcast. Now that would be great. That'd be cool.
Someday.
Right. Someday. Well, that's after 485 billion episodes. I'll finally do it. All right, that's going to do it for this week's episode. Until next week, I'm James Montemagno.
And I'm Frank Kruger. Thanks for watching and listening.
Peace.